Do you like the week 0? Everybody's going to watch some Georgia Tech football in week 0.
Well, it's one of those things, I think the hardest shot in golf is when everyone's standing around watching you on the tee box. It feels a little bit that way with Georgia Tech starting the season. And you get a week 0 game like that, and a lot of these games are pretty low key games, kind of maybe a power conference versus a non-power conference kind of game, or an FCS game even. And then Georgia Tech goes out and plays a ranked, ACC opponent. And so, yeah, hope you don't make a mess all over yourself in front of God and everyone.
And folks, if you're not aware, that game, of course, when Georgia Tech and Florida State get together, it should be played in Dublin, Ireland. So it's going to be the latest edition of college football going overseas. What comes to mind in regards to possible upsets would be Northwestern, a team that failed to win a game on our continent that particular year. This was 2 seasons ago. Did beat Nebraska in week 1, and they couldn't win a game in North America from September until December, but they won that one and then lost 11 straight. So maybe something strange happens over there at noon Eastern time, our time, with Georgia Tech and Florida State.
I think that's completely on the table, honestly, and I'm sure we'll get into schedule at some point. And Georgia Tech's schedule very tough this year, and that's a big one of it is that Florida State game to start off with. But I'm kind of with you, Mark. I mean, I think if there's a time that you want to get Florida State this year, with all the rebuild that they're having to do and all the replacements that they're having to do, it's probably right off the bat. And especially, going across the pond into a really odd environment and just getting everybody out of whack. I mean, I think that provides the best opportunity that you're going to have to beat Florida State and pull off what would be a pretty significant upset. I think right now they're like 12, 13-point favorites in that game.
But that 12-13, that also tells me that it's not some 25-point affair in Vegas's eyes. And 12 and 13 points, that's certainly substantial. There is a clear-cut favorite here, no doubt. But I am no odds maker or handicapper, but I do enjoy looking at all of that and make my predictions. And I was just reminding people just a few minutes ago that if you take the top 25 every week, and it's crazy how this plays out. It's almost like clockwork every week. If you take those 20 to 22 games played within the top 25, there are 4 to 5 upsets. There are 20 to 25% of the games are going to be upsets. And the amount of double-digit upsets in college football might surprise people as well. So they're out there. They happen. Don't know if this one's going to happen, but we'll start to break down the team in particular. And what comes to mind, Joey, for Georgia Tech football, when I think back a season, not to put and throw any shade on your team here, but I remind people that if Mario Cristobal would have done the right thing, then the perception of what Georgia Tech is coming into this season would be drastically different. Now, would the reality be much different? Probably not, although they did make a remarkable drive. So Miami handed them the game on one hand, but of course, Georgia Tech had to make some ridiculous plays with not much time left. A ridiculous throw to the left sideline, then of course broke the coverage and made the play that won the game. So it wasn't just handed to them on a silver platter. However, of course, they lose that game. The perception of 7-6 is now 5-7 because they don't get the opportunity to win the game against UCF. And that's another thing that stands out to me. They're down by 2 touchdowns and they come back in the bowl game to finish with a winning season. And a big deal for them. And then the other is that they played Georgia as well as they did in Atlanta to close out the regular season.
Yeah, I mean, and you talk about that Miami game. So, and not to make all the whole thing about odds, but if memory serves, Georgia Tech played 4 games in a row where the favorite was a double-digit favorite. 2 of them Georgia Tech was favored. 2 of them Georgia Tech was underdogs. They went 2-2 in those games. And you'll never believe that the favorite didn't win a single one of them. So twice they were favored by 2 touchdowns or more, and they lost. Twice they were 2 touchdown underdogs and won. And so it's like, I don't know what to make of that. It was a really strange season kind of in that way, where you had a couple of massive brain fart games that you're like, what is this team? I can't have any confidence in this, whatever. And then they turn around and yes, like they find a way to beat Miami, but the thing that I would try to remind people is that that's only possible because that was what was it, a 4 or 5 point game in the final minute. You played them really close for 59 minutes. That's only possible because you did. So between that and then beating North Carolina, you mentioned playing really close with Georgia. Like it was a little bit up and down, but the peaks were pretty confidence inspiring. I thought that it really feels like Brent Key and this coaching staff are building something. And that's something that it never really felt like there for a few years post Paul Johnson under Jeff Collins. It really didn't feel like any progress was being made year over year. So I would say that's the confidence inspiring piece for sure. And then it's like if you can just figure out how to avoid those brain fart losses against Boston College and Bowling Green. I mean, it would have even been that much better. And you really weren't that far from having a really good season. Not to mention, I mean, you had a lead on Louisville in the fourth quarter and couldn't hold on, so a lot of what could have been, I guess, in both directions with Georgia Tech last year. And you hope that the things that didn't go so well or the inconsistencies, you get those ironed out, and now you're prepared to take on what is a tough schedule, but hopefully give you some positive results and be part of what makes other teams' schedules tough as well.
Get Joey Weaver on the line, the basketball podcast. You see the particulars right there with Joey and Mike McDaniel getting together to, of course, the play on words here, folks, is the ACC is a basketball conference, but these two get together to talk ACC football.
Yep. Basketball conference, the ACC football podcast. We've never made ourselves out to be marketing geniuses, but it's a loving name that we gave it.
There's a fine line between foolishness and genius, so maybe it'll flip one day. You're going to cross that line. All right,
we'll see.
With Haynes King back at quarterback, Joey, looking at, of course, we go through that process of evaluating. Okay, we were this good this past year, and this is what happened. These are the additions. These are the subtractions. How should that convert now to 2024? So when you add all that up, what are we looking at?
I look at the transfer portal, kind of who came in, who went out, that kind of thing. Honestly, I don't know if this is like a drastically different team than it was last year. They return a lot of production on both sides of the ball. A couple of the folks that left on defense, I mean, you got pretty equivalent looking transfers in. I mean, I look at Kyle Kennard transfers out. He was probably your best pass rusher last year. Well, you get Romello Height transfers in from USC. That was a pretty good addition, I thought. You added Keelan Rutledge to the offensive line from Middle Tennessee. I think they're pretty excited about him. So, a lot of things like that I think they were able to maintain talent level here. Roster wise, I'm honestly impressed with what Brent Key and the staff are doing. I think that they're recruiting at a higher level than we've seen at Georgia Tech since I started covering them, back when I was in college. So I think it's comforting from that standpoint that I think they're building some depth within this roster that, again, I think you look at record and you think that, oh, well, they're still, not that talented or they're not that good of a roster. I think they might be. I think they can hang with some of these teams, again, as you saw. And so from that standpoint, I think that they're geared up. It's more an issue. I think specifically I would look at the defense and the scheme and the coaching and the organization, some of those things that would really be the sticking point going into this year.
Joey, since Paul Johnson was there and advanced his team to conference championship games, major bowl games, a couple Orange Bowls, this program has been, to the average college football fan, just kind of lost in a sea of Syracuse and Kansas, whoever else is out there, just that they can't really get a handle on. What are they about? Who do they have? But obviously some positive signs last year. So the general consensus seems to be about middle of the pack ACC, but we know how good sports writers are at predicting standings. So who knows what that's going to land on. Let me give you this stat, Joey, that may give you some hope for a breakout season. Would be that it came to my attention 6-7 years ago and looking at these preseason publications, Athlon, Street and Smith's, Lindy's, that they're way too conservative with their predictions, because I'd be looking at these and I'd be like, they're considering everybody basically to be the same team, and they're just kind of moving their record by one game typically from season to season. And I thought, okay, I'm going to start to track this and see if this is actually what college football is, because I think most people think, yeah, college football is static, it doesn't change, but they're looking at Alabama and Ohio State and Georgia. Yeah, they don't change, but the rest of the sport's in flux. And so I started to track, thinking, okay, 3 games is a significant difference in a season. You go from 3-9 to 6-6, or vice versa. So how many teams in the Power Five change that much from season to season? Well, it's generally, and I ask this question to people and they guess, oh, 7 or 8 teams. No, like 18 to 22 teams. Last year was 26 teams had that much of a swing in their record from season to season out of 70. So that's a third of the teams or more. And what's the likelihood that Georgia Tech's on the positive end of that swing, rather than, that would have to be a 9-3 or a 3-9?
Yeah, I'm going to try not to be a homer and be overly optimistic here, but I would say that if you told me that they're going to be 3 games different from last year's 6-6, I would say better chance that it's 9-3 than 3-9. I just think depth wise, I think what they're able to do in the trenches, I don't think that they're going to go 3-9. I think there's upside when you have a quarterback like Haynes King, who did what he did last year and started to show more consistency, and he got healthier during the year. I think a quarterback like that, I think that you look at a defense, they were 6-6 and a defense that was like bottom 30 in the country or something like that. You bring in a whole new staff, bring in your defensive coordinator, Tyler Santucci. He was Mike Elko's guy at Duke. I think that's some pretty good bona fides to have on your resume. So I think there's reason to think that they will improve rather than fall off going into this year. So yeah, I mean, I would say 9-3 more likely than 3-9, but I don't know how necessarily likely either of those are. For what that's worth.
I understand that that's a difficult call to make. 9-3 against that schedule, which I'm perusing right now. Yeah, there are a lot of landmines there. So Joey, before we let you go, focusing on this ACC situation, and sometimes when there's a little bit of news or somebody makes a comment, everybody reacts like, oh, this league's going to fall apart tomorrow. It's not. There's going to be an ACC maybe indefinitely if they're able to even bounce back like the Big 12 from some major losses that are probably imminent, because when you go to court to the extent that Clemson and Florida State have, I don't think there's any turning back. I think there's just way too much bad blood and money that's been spent. But off of their probable departures, then of course there's this wild speculation in regards to who's worth what. Well, Georgia Tech, well, these are the minuses, these are the pluses. They seem to be maybe in this tier with Louisville, NC State, where you can see some value, but at the same time, they're not necessarily going to move a needle in a conference at the same time. And I know a lot of people will push back on me putting them with NC State and Louisville. I'm not talking about as football teams right this second or in the last 5 years, but again, it's only been 10 years and less that they've been playing in ACC championship games and going to Orange Bowls. So what is your kind of read on the tea leaves of the way this could break and what Georgia Tech's possible options could be?
So I don't think of it in terms of if the ACC implodes and what would be the next conference. In a way, I would be very surprised if Georgia Tech ever ended up in another conference in the way that college football is currently constructed. The way that I think about it is, it's clear that we're moving towards a different model of this game. You're moving more towards some sort of NFL model of, the AFC and the NFC or something. There's going to be some breakaway of college football. My question becomes, how many teams make it to that next version, the Premier League or whatever it is? Because you hear people talk about, it could be, the top 32 programs go to that. I don't think Georgia Tech is one of those top 32 programs. I think most of those at this point are in the SEC and the Big Ten. But, if we draw the line at 48, do I think Georgia Tech's a top 48 program? Yeah, probably, or certainly in the conversation, reason to believe that they are. or any more than that. And I think there's a lot of ACC teams that applies to, where I don't think you make the cut on that kind of elite, high end subset of teams, but pretty solid mid level teams as well. Again, you mentioned in Louisville or an NC State. Um, I don't know what Virginia Tech is at this point as a brand, in value and things like that. But I think about those types of programs that certainly have a place and have been higher end football programs over the course of college football's history, but maybe aren't the very biggest fan bases, student bodies, alumni bases, like those kinds of things. So that's kind of the way that I think about it. Is it's going to depend on where we start drawing lines as to, does Georgia Tech make it into the elite end of whatever the next version of college football alignment is? Because depending on where you draw those cutoffs, maybe they make it, maybe they don't. They're kind of in that mid tier, as you were talking about, Mark.
So, Joey, I did say that was one last question. No, this is one last question, because I did want to look at the schedule, because who knows when we'll be able to get you back. How do you shake this out? Are you the type that looks at, okay, we got this stretch of 5, we need to win 4 or 3, or this 3 is murderer's row, if we could just steal one here? Take us through the schedule and let us know what you think of it. And another portion of this that I'm sure you and Mike have addressed at times is, the larger these conferences get, the more obviously there are would-be opponents that you don't play in the same conference. So the math right now is 17 teams in the ACC. There's 16 possible opponents. You only play 8, so you miss half the conference. So the fairness and equity of the schedules gets dispersed, and there becomes very tough schedules and very easy schedules. Rutgers doesn't play the probable 5 best teams in the Big Ten this year, for example. So just take us through the schedule and how difficult you believe it to be.
Well, first of all, by any metric you look at this, you look at the toughest schedules in the country, and you're going to see a whole bunch of SEC schedules, a whole bunch of Big Ten schedules, and you're going to see Georgia Tech's schedule. They are, far and away by metrics, they are the toughest schedule in the ACC, which isn't really anything new if you've been following Georgia Tech over the years. And this is actually the first year since, I believe, 1983 that they won't play Clemson. And honestly, I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, because it's like Clemson's starting to get a little bit more gettable, it seems like, than they had been for a number of years. But I guess to answer your question, Mark, I tend to like to group these games a little bit and say, oh, you need to split these. You need to, get 2 out of these 3, like that kind of thing. I mean, I certainly look at those first 5 games. I mean, Florida State, again, I think that's the time that you want to get them. A rebuilding team, get them on foreign soil, maybe as far out of their element as possible. You come home, and I think a lot of Georgia Tech fans are kind of terrified of that Georgia State game, figuring you got to come back a week later and play a team just from across town that's going to be hungry. You're going to be a big favorite in that game, but that's going to be a Super Bowl type of game for Georgia State. So that won't be fun. You go to Syracuse, which has historically been kind of a painful place to play for Georgia Tech. They had a really ugly loss there in 2020. I think it was the only game that Syracuse won all year. They beat them at the JMA Wireless Dome there in upstate New York. VMI, you'd like to write that in as a win. And then you go to Louisville. I mean, that's pretty tough. And so, those first 5 games, it's a little bit treacherous. I would say you need to go, at least 3-2 on that stretch. Ideally 4-1, I would think, and to be set up to go to a bowl game and have a good postseason. The off week, you get Duke, you go to North Carolina. I think both of those should be winnable. I think Duke in a little bit of a rebuild under Manny Diaz. North Carolina, you've beaten them, and it's been traditionally, you've had some luck against North Carolina even when they've been good. And then it's this back end of the schedule is really kind of your murderer's row. Again, you get Notre Dame, you get Miami, NC State, and then Georgia is 4 of your last 5. And then you got a road trip to Lane Stadium to go play the Hokies. And that's a game. I think that's a good measuring stick game, honestly, for both of those programs. I think they're kind of in a similar place. You'd rather get that game at home, but you got to go on the road for it. So, they're up against it here, Mark, honestly. And you look at all those little numbers next to those teams' names. a lot of them are projected to be pretty good. And so I don't know how much you can bank on winning. I mean, I think you look at this the back half of the schedule. I think if you win 2 of them, you might be talking about an upset in there. Like, I don't know how many of these you're going to be favored in to begin with. So it very much shapes up to be a challenge. And, one of the things you talk about not playing all the teams in the conference, Georgia Tech is actually one of the 2 programs in the ACC. I forget who the other one is, but they're one of the only 2 programs in the ACC that doesn't play any of the 3 new teams within the ACC. There's no SMU, no Cal, no Stanford, any of which I would feel a lot better about Georgia Tech's chances than I feel against, Miami and NC State and Florida State and so on and so forth.
Well, Joey, like you, I've seen all these schedule rankings, and I used to do them myself, and it just became so tedious, but it was fun. I used to rank all the schedules throughout the country, but like you, I've seen all SEC and Big Ten schools, and then boom, there's Georgia Tech at number 4, number 5, whatever the ranking is. And I know I've looked at their schedule at some point, but I am just now letting it sink in. Florida's become famous for their final 5 to 7 game stretch with, Ole Miss, LSU, Georgia constantly. But that is about as difficult as I got to think anybody else is playing in the country the final 6 weeks of the season.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, this has got to be up there, right? And, thankfully a majority of these games are at home, which kind of helps you. Now, I don't know how much you would call Mercedes-Benz Stadium at home for the Notre Dame game, but you get a couple of bye weeks in there. Getting Miami with in between 2 bye weeks is kind of an odd little quirk in the schedule, but that I figure that kind of helps to some degree. There's a comment from Jackson Johnson. North Carolina is the other school that doesn't have any of the 3 new programs on the schedule. So, yeah, just, it's kind of a strange scheduling quirk. We're going to have to see. And again, I hope that Brent Key is building the program the way that I think he is. And at the very least, you're competitive in these games, and you never know. Again, a game like Miami last year where it just falls off the back of a truck, but you got to be in position to pick it up and run with it. So hopefully, at the very least, they're there. And, I think back the last 2 years under Brent Key's leadership, he's coached the game against Georgia, and they've given him a run for it. Both those last 2 games, much more than I think a lot of people expected him to. So maybe there's something there. Maybe you get that game for the first time since 2016. You get that win. But yeah, like I said, I mean, if you win more than 2 of those, it's pretty much certainly going to involve an upset somewhere. So I think you got to start fast if you want to get to a bowl game, looking at where that schedule is and where it falls.
All right, folks, your college football season begins with Georgia Tech this year, taking on Florida State, of course, week 0. That's the one we're all going to watch if we want to watch college football on the 24th of August. Well, enjoy it, Joey. We appreciate you stopping by. It's been great to see you and catch up. And before I botch it, because I do every time I attempt to, the podcast and where people can find it.
Absolutely. It's called Basketball Conference. It's an ACC football podcast, make no mistake, but it is called Basketball Conference. It's anywhere you can find your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, whatever you do. Also on YouTube, youtube.com/@the-ACC football podcast. So come find us there. We do live recaps here during the season. We get on and we'd love to have people join us to give their comments and join in the discussion as we get into the college football season.
Awesome. Thanks, Joey.
Thanks,
Enjoy
Mark.
the game, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Yep. Enjoyed it. Thank you.